There's a question that keeps coming up in my messages over and over from people who are kind, thoughtful, deeply feeling human beings, and the question is always some version of this. Why does it feel like the more compassionate I am, the more I attract people who take advantage of that compassion? Why does being an empath, being someone who genuinely feels what other people feel, seem to function less like a gift and more like a target painted on my back? And I want to answer that honestly today. Because the answer isn't mystical, it isn't about bad luck, and it isn't about being too nice. The answer is rooted in psychology, in patterns so predictable that once you understand them, you'll start seeing them everywhere, in your own life, in the lives of people around you, maybe even in relationships you're standing inside of right now without fully realizing what's happening. Let's start with the foundation of it, because I think this gets misunderstood constantly. Being an empath doesn't mean you're simply sensitive in some vague, soft sense of the word. It means your nervous system is wired to absorb and mirror the emotional states of the people around you, often before you've consciously registered what's happening. You walk into a room and you feel the tension before anyone says a word. You sense when someone is struggling, even when they're smiling and insisting they're fine. This is an extraordinary capacity. But here's the part that changes everything. It also means you are exceptionally good at sensing potential in people. You see who someone could become. You feel the wounded child underneath their defensiveness. You sense the pain driving their anger. And this ability, this beautiful, rare ability to see past someone's worst behavior into their underlying hurt, is exactly what certain people are drawn to, and exactly what certain people learn to exploit. Because here's the uncomfortable truth nobody tells empaths early enough. The very sensitivity that lets you love people deeply is the same sensitivity that makes you an ideal target for people who specifically look for someone who will tolerate more than they should. Manipulative people, people with narcissistic traits, people who thrive on control, don't randomly select their partners or friends. They test. They probe. They watch how you respond to small boundary violations early on, and if you respond with patience, with generosity, with an eagerness to understand their side of things, that response gets logged. Not necessarily consciously, not necessarily as some cartoonish villain plotting in the shadows, but logged nonetheless as useful information. This person is safe to push further with. This person will explain away my behavior. This person will find the good in me, even when I'm not showing them any. This is why empaths so often find themselves in relationships that follow an eerily similar pattern, regardless of who the specific person is. It starts with an intensity that feels like destiny. This person seems to see you in a way no one else ever has. They mirror your values back to you almost perfectly. They seem to understand your pain without you having to explain it. And what you don't realize in that moment is that you are not encountering compatibility. You are encountering a mirror, deliberately or instinctively held up to reflect exactly what you're hoping to find. Manipulative people, especially those with narcissistic tendencies, are often remarkably good at this early mirroring because they've learned through years of interactions exactly what words make an empath feel finally, deeply understood. And an empath, starved for that kind of recognition, understandably leans in. But here's where the real pattern begins. And this is the part I want you to really absorb, because it explains almost every relationship that starts euphoric and ends devastating. Once an empath is invested, emotionally, sometimes financially, sometimes through years of shared history, the testing shifts from mirroring to boundary erosion. Small requests that feel unreasonable, but not unreasonable enough to justify walking away over. A slight dismissiveness that gets explained away as a bad day. A promise broken, followed by an apology so convincing that the broken promise gets filed away as an aberration rather than a pattern. And because empaths are so skilled at seeing the good in people, so gifted at giving context and grace, they do exactly what they've always done. They extend understanding. They give the benefit of the doubt. They think, I know they're better than this, I've seen it, not realizing that what they saw in the beginning was never a stable truth about who this person consistently is. It was a performance, calibrated specifically to hook someone who leads with empathy rather than caution. I want to pause here and say something important because I don't want this to sound like empaths are naive or foolish, because that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is actually a mismatch between two very different operating systems. An empath operates from a place of assuming good faith, of believing that if they just communicate clearly enough, love generously enough, understand deeply enough, the other person will eventually rise to meet that energy. This assumption is not wrong in itself. It's actually what makes healthy relationships between two emotionally mature people work beautifully. The problem is that this assumption completely breaks down when it meets someone who isn't operating from good faith at all. Someone who experiences your empathy not as an invitation to grow, but as a resource to be managed and drawn from. Two fundamentally different psychologies, reading the exact same behavior through completely different lenses. You offer patience as an act of love. They receive patience as evidence that they can keep doing what they're doing without consequence. And this is where I need to introduce something crucial to understanding this whole pattern, the concept of emotional labor asymmetry. In relationships between an empath and someone with manipulative or narcissistic tendencies, the emotional labor is almost never equally distributed, and over time this imbalance becomes so normalized that the empath stops even noticing it's happening. You become the one who remembers the important dates, who smooths over conflicts, who translates your needs into gentler and gentler language so they land softer, who does the emotional processing for both people in the relationship because the other person either can't or won't do it themselves. And because you're so capable of doing this labor, because you're so naturally attuned to managing emotional atmospheres, it becomes invisible to them and eventually, devastatingly, to you too. You stop recognizing how much you're carrying because carrying it has become your normal, and normal doesn't announce itself as unfair. It just quietly becomes the water you're swimming in. There's also something deeper going on here, something that traces back further than any single relationship. Many empaths were taught, very early in life, that their value came from their usefulness to others' emotions. Maybe you grew up in a household where you were the emotional regulator, the peacekeeper, the one who sensed tension before it erupted and worked quietly to prevent it. Maybe you learned that being needed was safer than simply being wanted, because being needed came with a kind of guaranteed role, a guaranteed place at the table, while being wanted felt uncertain, conditional, something that could be withdrawn at any time. And if that's your foundation, then of course as an adult you gravitate toward dynamics where you're needed intensely, because on some unconscious level, being needed that intensely feels like proof that you matter, even when the way you're being needed is actually hollowing you out. This is precisely why the people who exploit empathy don't just take advantage of kindness in the moment. They take advantage of an old wound that was already there, long before this relationship began. They don't create the vulnerability, they locate it. And once they locate it, they don't even need to work very hard, because the empath's own history does most of the work for them, filling in gaps, offering excuses, staying loyal past the point where loyalty makes any logical sense because some old part of that empath is still trying to earn the safety and consistency they never quite got the first time around. So if you've ever wondered why it feels like your compassion attracts the exact people who least deserve it, I want you to understand this isn't a character flaw. It isn't proof that you're broken or too naive to function in the world. It's the predictable outcome of a specific psychological dynamic. Deep empathy meeting calculated or instinctive exploitation, layered on top of an old, unresolved belief that your worth is measured by how much you can give, absorb, and forgive. And once you see this pattern clearly, once you can actually name it instead of just feeling its effects, something shifts. Because you can't dismantle a pattern you can't see. But the moment you can see it, really see it, not just intellectually understand it, but feel the recognition land in your body, you stop being someone this pattern happens to, and you start becoming someone who finally gets to interrupt it. You stop being someone this pattern happens to, and you start becoming someone who finally gets to interrupt it. And interrupting it is not a single dramatic moment. It's not one big confrontation. One perfect speech that changes everything overnight. It's a slow, deliberate rewiring of instincts you've probably had since childhood, and I want to walk you through what that rewiring actually looks like, because understanding the pattern is only half the work. The other half is learning how to live differently once you can see it clearly. The first shift has to happen in how you interpret intensity. For most empaths, intensity has always been mistaken for depth. The faster someone opens up to you, the faster they seem to see you, the more it feels like proof of a rare, meaningful connection. But I need you to hold a different question up against that feeling from now on. Is this intensity earned or is it manufactured? Earned intensity builds slowly, through consistent actions across time, through someone showing you who they are in ordinary, unremarkable moments, not just in curated, emotionally charged ones. Manufactured intensity arrives too fast, feels almost theatrical in its perfection, and this is the part to really watch for, seems to already know exactly what you need to hear before you've even said it out loud. If someone seems to be reading from a script written specifically for your deepest longing to be understood, that's not fate. That's a red flag wearing the costume of destiny. Real connection reveals itself. It doesn't perform itself. The second shift is learning to treat your own exhaustion as information rather than a personal failing. Empaths are so used to interpreting fatigue, resentment, or dread as evidence that they're not doing enough, not patient enough, not understanding enough, not spiritually evolved enough to handle this relationship gracefully, that they miss what that exhaustion is actually telling them. Chronic emotional fatigue in a relationship is not a sign that you need to give more. It's a sign that the labor has become unsustainable. And unsustainable labor is not a permanent condition you're supposed to transcend. It's a signal you're supposed to act on. If you find yourself constantly depleted after interactions with someone, constantly performing emotional maintenance just to keep the relationship stable, that depletion isn't proof of your inadequate effort. It's proof that the relationship's foundation was never actually balanced to begin with, and no amount of additional effort from you is going to fix an imbalance that was never yours to fix alone. The third shift, and this one is deeply uncomfortable for most empaths, is learning to stop offering understanding as a substitute for boundaries. This is such a critical distinction because empaths are so good at understanding why someone behaves the way they do. The childhood wound, the insecurity, the fear driving the controlling behavior, that they start to believe understanding the reason is the same thing as accepting the behavior. It is not. You can hold enormous compassion for why someone became who they are and still refuse to keep absorbing the consequences of who they currently choose to be. Understanding explains a pattern. It does not excuse continuing to live inside of it. And I want to be very clear about something here because I think it gets lost. Setting a boundary is not an act of coldness. It is not a betrayal of your empathetic nature. It is, in fact, empathy correctly applied, because it includes yourself in the circle of people you extend compassion to, instead of leaving yourself permanently on the outside of your own care. The fourth shift is learning to recognize the specific feeling of being needed versus the feeling of being valued, because empaths so often confuse the two, and mistaking one for the other is exactly what keeps them tethered to relationships that are draining them dry. Being needed feels urgent, feels flattering in the moment, feels like proof of your indispensability. But being needed by someone who never reciprocates your care, who treats your presence as a resource rather than a relationship, is not love. It's extraction, dressed up convincingly enough that it took you this long to recognize it for what it is. Being valued feels different. It feels calm instead of urgent. It feels like being met, not just consumed. It doesn't require you to constantly prove your worth through how much you're willing to tolerate. And learning to crave being valued over being needed is one of the single most important shifts an empath can make, because it changes the entire type of person you find yourself drawn to going forward. I also want to talk about something that doesn't get said enough in these conversations. Healing this pattern doesn't mean becoming less empathetic. I know that fear is there, quietly, for a lot of people listening right now. The fear that protecting yourself means hardening, means losing the very quality that makes you who you are, means becoming someone colder, more guarded, less capable of the deep connection that's always been your gift. But that's not what this is. You're not being asked to feel less. You're being asked to add discernment to your empathy, not subtract the empathy itself. Discernment isn't the opposite of compassion. It's what makes compassion sustainable. Without it, empathy becomes something that gets weaponized against you over and over by people who learn exactly how to access it. With it, empathy becomes what it was always supposed to be, a gift you offer by choice to people who have shown you they're capable of holding it with care, instead of a reflex you extend indiscriminately to anyone who performs enough vulnerability to trigger it. And here's something worth sitting with. The people who deserve your empathy the most are usually the ones who never had to manipulate you into giving it. They don't test your boundaries to see how far they stretch. They don't require intensity or urgency to earn your attention. They show up consistently in the unremarkable, unglamorous moments, and they extend the same emotional labor back to you that you naturally extend to them without you having to ask, without you having to teach them, without you having to explain over and over why reciprocity matters. If you've spent years around people who required constant explanation just to treat you decently, I need you to understand that is not the standard. That was never the standard. That was just the pattern you got used to, mistaking familiarity for what was actually possible. So let's bring this all the way back to the beginning, to that question so many of you have asked me: why do empaths always seem to attract the wrong people? The honest answer is that they don't attract the wrong people because something is wrong with them. They attract certain people because their empathy, untrained in discernment, sends out a very specific signal that here is someone who will extend grace far past the point where grace is deserved, who will do the emotional labor for two people, who will see the good in you even when you're not consistently showing it. That signal is beautiful when it reaches someone capable of meeting it honestly, and it is dangerous when it reaches someone who isn't. The goal was never to stop sending out empathy into the world. The goal is to stop sending it out blindly, to start requiring what should have always been required: consistency, reciprocity, evidence, not just potential. Because here's what I want you to carry with you after this conversation ends. Somewhere out there tonight, an empath is sitting with someone who makes them feel simultaneously exhausted and responsible, giving one more explanation for behavior that never should have needed explaining in the first place. And maybe, for the first time, instead of reaching for more patience, more understanding, more of themselves to hand over, they're going to pause. They're going to ask the question that changes everything. Am I extending grace because this person has earned it, or because I've been trained to extend it regardless? And in that pause, in that single moment of choosing discernment over instinct, something ancient and automatic finally gets interrupted. That is the real turning point. Not the moment you stop caring. You were never meant to stop caring, and honestly, you never will, because that capacity is simply who you are. The turning point is the moment your empathy stops being something the world can access without permission and starts becoming something you offer deliberately to the people who have proven, through their actions and not just their words, that they're capable of holding it the way it deserves to be held. And when that shift finally happens, when you learn to protect the gift instead of giving it away to anyone who asks, you won't lose your softness. You'll finally understand what it was always meant to protect. Not everyone, not automatically. Just the ones who show you, consistently, that they were worth it all along.